Hi, I'm Josh, and no part of this video is made using AI. So in this roundup of the games I played in the month of June, I did almost no video gaming because the month of June was characterized by a lot of computer problems. So we're going to go back to old school style and only talk about board games for the month of June. There were two new to me games that I played this month, both of which coincidentally were Lord of the Rings themed games. And in fact, as I go through my list in order of my lowest rated game of the month to my highest rated of the game of the month, the first three I'm going to talk about, or in other words, the worst three of the month, are all Lord of the Rings themed board games. The first one I have to talk about here was one of my new to me games that was given to me in April on my birthday. And a friend of mine showed up with a board game shaped wrapped gift. And as all hobby board gamers do when they are presented with a gift from either a non-gamer or a casual gamer, the heart kind of sinks and they go, oh gosh, what have I got here? And I opened the gift and it was a cooperative board game and Lord of the Rings themed, both very positive things, and it's a game called The Lord of the Rings Adventure to Mount Doom. Now, having previously looked up this game and realizing that it wasn't going to be a game that I was all that interested in, I thought, well, since this was given to me as a gift, I would at least put it on the table and play it solo, because being a cooperative game, it is the type of game you can play solo quite easily. And, you know, overall, it was a long 90 minutes of trying to roll well on D6s, essentially is what the game came down to. It could potentially be a good family game to play with slightly older kids if it wasn't such a long game. If there was a way that they could sort of pare down that overall game length, it might be a half decent family game, but as it was, it wasn't for me at all. I admit it was fun to just try one time on my own, and so I did, you know, enjoy my one play of it, but it's not something I have any interest in playing again, and my rating of the game is a 3.5 out of 10. You know, the theme is interesting. A couple of minor things about the game are interesting. The artwork's kind of cool, but overall I didn't think it was a great design. But my friend was so close, because if he had given me another cooperative Lord of the Rings themed board game that recently came out, it could have been much more exciting, because the next game that I had a chance to play was also new to me, a game called Lord of the Rings Fate of the Fellowship. And the reason I got to play this game was because it showed up on Board Game Arena, and so I thought I would give a solo play of the game a try on BGA. Now, this ended up being a very rare instance where after playing the game, I have really no idea what to think of it, for a couple of reasons. One is that playing on the computer on BGA is not at all an ideal way to play board games, and in fact the more I do it, the less I enjoy it. It is just so hard to take all the visual information that you get in front of you on the tabletop and condense it onto your screen. Even though I have a big TV that I'm playing all the computer stuff onto, it is still very hard to make out everything that's going on in the visual format of the screen, as well as the user interface obviously being much more awkward on screen than when you're just manipulating physical board game components. So playing on BGA adds to the frustration of the game. In addition to that, it's not a very good solo game, I don't think. So that also added to the frustration of the gameplay. Now, we did have some really cool stuff going on, though. It is an obvious iteration of the Fall of Rome version of Pandemic, which is the only other kind of very different version of Pandemic that I've played besides the legacy versions of Pandemic. And it is the one version that I do own because I enjoy it quite a lot. Now, whereas Fall of Rome was a game that Matt Leacock, the Pandemic designer, co-designed with Paolo Mori, the Lord of the Rings Fate of the Fellowship only has Matt Leacock listed as the designer even though he's clearly borrowed a lot of elements from Fall of Rome that was co-designed by Paolo Mori. And in this case, Matt Leacock does do some very clever and interesting things, both with the game design and incorporating it into the Lord of the Rings world and theme. I especially enjoy the variety of game goals and victory conditions that you add into the game, which really mixes up the way the game is played, and in so doing gives a lot of variety to how you play the game. On the negative side of things, whereas in any other version of Pandemic that I've played, I always feel like when I'm doing a character's turn that I have about 8 actions worth of things that I want to do with only 4 available actions. But this game was really the opposite, where much of the time I wasn't even using all available actions on each character's turn, and in fact I was even occasionally skipping characters' entire turns altogether because they were sitting at a location with almost the right cards they needed to fulfill the victory conditions of the location, but waiting for those cards to become available. So I was wasting an enormous number of action points, and in the end I really did completely horribly in terms of the victory of the game. In fact, I don't think I successfully completed any of the victory conditions in the game, and my overall feeling of playing that game was one of extreme frustration. And like I said, part of that had to do with the way the solo game works, where in a multiplayer game, every player has their hand of up to 7 cards, and the challenge of that is getting the right cards to the right players at the different locations. So there's a large card pool, but it can be tricky to get them to the right spots, whereas playing solo, you have only your single hand of 7 cards, so you have all cards available for all characters at all locations at the map, but you have to discard every time you go over 7 cards, so you have a very small pool of cards that is widely available for all characters, which makes it hard for any of the characters to complete the condition that they're trying to work towards and to collect the type of cards they need in order to fulfill those conditions. Now, I do recognize that with this being my first play of the game, I obviously played very poorly. Just you can tell by the amount of actions I was wasting every turn that I was playing really suboptimally. So the way I was playing the game wasn't anywhere close to being ideal, which is funny because I have so much experience with Pandemic that you would think it would be almost second nature to me by now, but it seems like this game needs a different approach in some way. And so in order to really properly assess the game, I would definitely need to play it more to see if it gets less frustrating, playing it maybe with 1 or 2 other players, for instance, playing it in physical formats, though I really don't know if it would be enjoyable enough to replace Fall of Rome for me. In comparing those 2 games, yes, it is doing some really interesting things with the Lord of the Rings theme and with the Pandemic system, but I already quite enjoy Fall of Rome, so I don't know if that would be a replacement. Also, it was a pretty long play time of about 90 minutes for my first solo play there, so it felt like a bit of a long game overall. My initial rating, like I said, a little hard to come up with, but I gave it a 6 out of 10 as an initial rating. This isn't something that you should take too seriously though, because like I said, I would definitely need more plays to really fully assess the game. Overall though, it felt disappointing in how frustrating and not fun the game was. And then moving on to my third Lord of the Rings themed game, I'm going to talk just briefly about the Fellowship of the Ring trick-taking game again, which is one that I mentioned for the first time last month in my games played in May. And last month I had played only the first 2 scenarios with my friend Mark. We won the first one, lost the second one. In June, I played this with Paul, and we played the first 5 chapters. We won the first 4 and lost the 5th one. My overall assessment with further plays remains about the same as it was last month, in that it is a very good cooperative trick-taking game with really great artwork that does not seem ideal with 2 players. It does work with the way they shoehorn that third non-player character into the game, but it would be much more ideal with 3 or 4 players. I don't particularly enjoy trick-taking games for the most part, and Paul and I ran into this really strange thing where In each chapter, it adds an interesting new twist, usually in the form of another character that you add to your game, and that character has a different win condition, so it switches slightly up the play style of the game. So each one is slightly new and interesting. But in that 5th chapter, it really felt like the one condition that was added was entirely luck dependent in terms of how cards were drawn, and it didn't seem to us like there was a way to strategically work around it. Either you got lucky and you won, or you got unlucky and lost, which is what happened to us. So overall, I would say my rating of the game stays the same at 6.5 out of 10. Paul gives it an 8.5 out of 10, and he said it would have been a 9 if it wasn't for the randomness of that 5th chapter. Now, Paul is a big fan of trick-taking games, and especially some of those classic trick-taking games like Wizard and so forth. But I do think it's fun. It's really quick to get to the table and knock off a couple of games, and it's an enjoyable experience, just not a top-tier game for me. The next one is a classic card game called Hardback, which is more or less a combination of Gloomhaven, Dominion, the deck building game, with Scrabble, the word making game, in that you have a deck of letter cards that you are gradually building up and deck building over the course of the game, and you're using those cards to form words like in Scrabble and scoring points in that manner. The reason I decided to play it again was because I was watching people playing a professional Scrabble game on YouTube, because I am a bit of a word nerd and a language geek, and so that type of thing appeals to me, and it put me in the mood for spelling words. And so I again went on to Board Game Arena and played a solo game, and once again got entirely frustrated by the way the solo game of Hardback is so impossibly difficult. In fact, I only got to make 10 words over the course of the 30-minute game, and I scored 21 points before the AI reached the 60 points they needed to end the game for victory. So it was just a really unsatisfying experience, given how brutally hard that solo mode is. Paul and I have played it cooperatively against the AI and found it even that way is extremely difficult. You really have to add in some of the expansion stuff to make the game easier, to give you any chance of beating that either solo/cooperative mode. But yeah, it's a great game. It's one that I enjoy playing competitively against other players, and so I give it a 7.5 out of 10. Paul giving it a 7 out of 10 in the past. But as a solo or cooperative experience, it just doesn't really work all that well, unfortunately. Again, playing on Board Game Arena is not super ideal either. Next up, I got back to Magic the Gathering for the first time this year. For some reason, my older son, Evan, got it into his mind that he wanted to go back to a bit of deck building, and he put together a couple of decks. So we tested them out and played 2 games against each other, with the second game in particular being quite epic. He had made a mono green and a mono black deck, so we pitted them against each other, and it ended up coming down to where each of us had only 2 life remaining, and the black side pulled off the win against the green side. So it was really fun to get back to a couple more plays of Magic again. It's been a long time. I rate the game 7.5 out of 10. Maybe I'll have to do a bit of deck building at some point again too. I have at least a couple dozen decks, all in various stages of build and half build and torn up to rebuild and that sort of thing. Going up to the next game is Skye Team. Once again, Paul and I played this cooperative 2-player game of landing an airplane. We managed to squeak out a win on the yellow difficulty, which is the second easiest difficulty, using the Warsaw Airport. And it was the narrowest of victories that we managed to pull off by using our very last coffee on the very last action of the game to get the exact number we needed for that final die placement. So it was an exciting finish, and it's always a fun game. I rate it 9 out of 10. Paul gives it a perfect 10 out of 10, and he joked he would give it a 12 out of 10 if he could. In the past, Evan has given it an 8.5, and Charlie, my nephew, an 8 out of 10. Our second best of the month was the big event of the month, and I actually was super excited to get out Chaos in the Old World again, and once again get to the table my massively customized version of the game, where I've customized pretty much every component in the game other than the cards, as far as I can remember. So this is an event that we did for my birthday in 2024, and I had tried to organize it for this April 2025, and it didn't work out. However, In June, I did manage to actually get my younger brother, one of my brother's friends, my friend Paul, and even my youngest son Wyatt, to get a full 5-player game to play the base game along with the Horned Rat expansion. So in this case, we had 2 very experienced players of the game, Paul, who has played it the most, myself, who's played it second most. We had my brother, who has played it one time in the past when we played last year in 2024. And then we had 2 players who were new to the game, my brother's friend and my son Wyatt. And to nobody's surprise, Paul won the game because he always wins Chaos in the Old World. He was playing a Slaanesh and pulled off a dial victory, but he also had 52 victory points. So in the same round, he essentially passed the 50 points needed for victory, but won the dial victory because that's what takes precedence over the victory points. Although my brother, playing as Khorne, had 57 victory points, which if Paul hadn't pulled off that dial victory, he would have won on victory points. But he just couldn't prevent Paul from getting that final dial tick he needed to beat him with the dial over his victory points. My son Wyatt, playing as Tzeentch, did amazingly well, actually. I would say this is the first really complex board game Wyatt has ever played, one that is really above that family weight level of a game, and he did really well by achieving 48 victory points. Now, the 2 of us who did not do very well were my brother's friend, playing as Nurgle, who seemed fairly frustrated overall with his first play of the game and only ended up with 34 victory points, whereas I, playing as the Horned Rat, the expansion character, just did absolutely terribly. I only had 24 victory points, so basically I was less than halfway to victory on the victory point side of things, so I really did quite terrible playing as the Horned Rat. But I thought it was a fun play experience overall. I have worked very hard over the years on combining cards from both the base game and expansion content to try to get the best balance of play I can amongst all the Chaos Gods. Of course, it's really difficult to know how well balanced they are when the players have massively different experience levels with the game, but I did realize that there were a couple of cards, especially in the Old World deck, that were making things very unbalanced for 1 or 2 of the gods specifically, whereas the other gods weren't affected by it. And in fact, it kind of pulled away the victory from the Khorne player to a certain extent by really nerfing a lot of his power in the final couple turns of the game through the random Old World cards that came out. So I realized that I did have to do a bit of further refining to try to get that balance correct for everybody. It's a tough game to balance because it's so asymmetrical. All the characters play out very differently. And I certainly don't want to cause frustration for players who are on the verge of winning the game through their great play only to be nerfed by a random card pull. But overall, I rate the game 9 out of 10. Paul rates it a 9 out of 10. And it was super exciting to get this game to the table that I've put such an incredible, stupid amount of work into enhancing the physical components of, as well as balancing, like I said, the various characters and so forth. Now, the number 1 best game of the month was Isle of Skye Big Box. Just love this tile-laying game of building up your own little Scottish clan territory. And as so often happens, I was playing this 2 players with Paul, and I was doing extremely well on the tactical side of things. Got off to a quick lead on the scoreboard, maintained a big lead throughout the entire game, but Paul was working behind the scenes more towards the long-term strategy side of the game, and when it came time to tally up the points, I, like I said, was quite far ahead based on the points accumulated throughout the game, but when we added up all the end game points, we ended up tied at 127 points to 127, with Paul winning the tiebreaker by having about 7 more coins than me at the end. So he squeaked out the most narrow of victories after trailing so far behind all game. This is a game that I've actually boosted the score from a 9 out of 10 to a 9.5 out of 10 because I think it's just such a almost perfect game. Paul, in fact, had boosted his rating as well. He previously rated it a 7.5 out of 10, and he raised that to an 8 out of 10. So it was fun to see that we both just enjoy the game more the more we play it. So that was my month of June in gaming. I'd love to hear what you've been playing, whether it be video games or board games. What's been grabbing your attention lately? What have been some of the favorites you've been playing? Are there any upcoming games that you're excited about? Did you get anything in the Steam sale or the summer Steam sale? I'd love to hear all about it. Please do get into the comments and let me know. And I just really appreciate you watching. Cheers. The game that it could have do some very clever and it also build and repair and editing and that we're unaffecting to towards